Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and first, Dennis uh, apologized because he's missed now several Mondays. Unfortunately, today he's attending a wake. My condolences to the family, and Dennis, we look forward to having you back soon. But I'm really pleased to have as a special guest today Bill Watkins. Bill Watkins is a research fellow at the Independent Institute, and his new book on the Constitution was just released. It's called The Independent Guide to the Constitution. He's also a who also has written several other books. Is Social Justice Just? He contributed to that one. A book on patent trolls, Crosswords for Liberty, and Reclaiming the American Revolution. I have actually read all of those except for the Independent Guide to the Constitution, which I'm in process of reading. So I'm really very, very fortunate that Bill has accepted to join Bruce and I today. Um, and and I encourage everyone to read the book. And I'm sure after hearing Bill talk, I'm sure that a lot of people will be very interested in this book. So I'm going to do a brief start. I am. I'm not someone who's a lawyer by training. I have experience with the law because I've negotiated a lot of contracts as a business person, and I like to be, an informed user of the law. So my opinion, based upon my sense of my own philosophical framework and my own set of principles, is that I think that basically when people get down and sign a contract, or people sign something on their behalf where people have granted their consent to, like we had with the Constitution. It was not like the Constitutional Convention got together and they decided in a room that they could bind the American people. No, they had to get the document ratified by basically essentially a supermajority of the people, and for people to be bound by it. And so I think that when you have people either signing a contract or designating people who negotiate on your behalf, and then like at a shareholders meeting, where you have basically a vote where you agree to a consensus mechanism where a supermajority ends up representing everyone. If you believe that's a legitimate way of a form of governance, that basically the people voted on the ratification of a specific document, and that specific document you could view as a form of a contract. And that specific document stated that there was a way of altering that document, and it was called an amendment process. So the document doesn't say that judges get to amend the Constitution. It doesn't mean the judges get to look for things implied, in the document. It means they got to read the document. The document's pretty clear in most respects. They talk about Article 1 powers. They're pretty clear what the Article 1 powers are. The Article 2 powers are pretty clear. I mean, so most of the things, it's really laid out in black and white. Who issues tariffs? Who manages elections? All this stuff they were pretty clear upon. So I think a lot of the disputes we see today is because of how the document has morphed over time. But the morphing has had nothing to do with people consenting to amendments. It has to do with the president claiming more powers or some branch powers, and then basically the court validating it even without any reference to what the founders might have meant by the words that were intended to meet at the time they wrote the document. And there's a pretty extensive paper trail associated with that process, because Madison has left copious notes, and the founders were great writers and letter writers. So there's a large body of literature to basically understand, what their intentions were in the documents that they signed. So I find that the only legitimate way of changing and altering the document is not through a court finding things that don't exist in the document, but by amending the document. And I think that was what Jefferson's intent was, which is why he suggested that the document have a finite life to it, and why authors, people like Lysander Spooner, said that basically the document has no authority because it can't bind people who are not signatories to the document. Now, I'm not claiming that if I took in a law school class and gave that as an answer, that I'd get an A or a B, I might get a law professor. Fail me for that. But as a non-lawyer, as a person who I think is a reasonably informed citizen, for me, it's my definition of what meets legitimacy. So, on that, I would like to first hand this over to our guest today, Bill, and then Bruce. So, thank you both.
Hey, good to be with both you and Bruce today, Jeffrey. My take is I agree with the idea that the Constitution should only be amended through Article 5, and it shouldn't be through the courts discovering or updating matters as they see fit. I don't have a problem describing the Constitution as a contract. The framers more typically use the word compact, essentially an agreement between sovereign states. And when we say sovereign states, I mean the people of the several states, because the framers were clear at the ratification convention, the action of a mere legislature would not be enough to ratify the Constitution. The act of ratification had to come from specially called conventions in each state, where the people elected delegates to up or down on the Constitution. And they did this in their constituent capacity, the highest sovereign capacity known in the United States, the people of the several states there. Of course, a couple of states didn't ratify immediately and stayed outside the Union. Rhode Island and North Carolina were outside the Union for a while until they were assured that amendments would be adopted and were being adopted out of the first Congress. So I would describe the Constitution as properly a compact among the sovereign entities of each state, which are the people of each state, and agree with you that it can only be amended as set forth in Article 5.
So at that point in time for the states that stayed out, and Bruce, I'll then give you your time, but I just want to, at that point in time when the states, that the two states were lagging in determining whether they would enter this compact, as you called it, Bill. James Madison was not suggesting to George Washington, get on your horse. These are people treason. Let's conscript all the other states and let's invade them and take them over and coerce them to sign this document. Did either Madison or Jefferson, asked to do that, or was it acknowledged that they were sovereign states that could decide to enter or not, at their discretion, and they would try to encourage to enter through a negotiation process?
No, that's right. Originally the preamble is written of the Constitution enumerated each state. We, the people of the states of, names each one. But when the framers realized that, well, maybe not everyone's going to join this union, that's where we get we, the people, and without the enumeration of states. So they fully knew that some states might stay outside the union, and there was no talk of military coercion against these two recalcitrant states.
Bruce?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a quip of Samuel Johnson. All theory is in favor, but all experience is against. I think your commentary about this being, a contract, and I think it's totally unworkable, and it's a cure worse than the disease. Let me begin by asking both of you if this is simply a contract that one party can exit at any time, pay damages if that's the contract remedy. Do you believe that you have authority on your own, wake up one day and say, I'm not complying with any laws of the United States. I'm seceding. I'm going to establish relations with other foreign countries. I'm going to be my own sovereignty. Is under your theory of contract, do you have the authority, because that's a typical contract remedy, to do that and simply exit out of the United States, just like, Rhode Island and North Carolina? I guess they deferred actually ratifying the Constitution.
Bill, do you want to take that?
Well, I would say, well, first of all, I'm not I don't buy into the each individual can secede.
Why
but
not? But pause there. Why? Why don't you believe each individual can secede?
Because the Constitution was adopted by the people of the states. I believe a state.
No, it says the people of the United States is the language. We the people of the United States.
No, that's the preamble, which is not operative, Bruce. You have to look at Article 7, which says that the Constitution does not become operative until it is ratified by 9 states, and it's only operative among those states, so ratifying.
True enough. I understand that. But it still speaks of, and you have to compare that, I believe, Bill, with the language that's quite different in the Articles of Confederation, which was the predecessor to the Constitution, which made it clear this uses the language that you've just described in the Articles of Confederation that are not there in the Constitution, saying this is an agreement among the separate sovereign states. And that language is not in the U.S. Constitution, in part because it was thought that all the separate states having their own independent sovereignty was creating chaos. Foreign countries were exploiting it. There are all sorts of protectionist barriers were going up. But it comes back to, if it's a contract, why aren't individuals entitled to walk away from the contract? They didn't have a chance to vote on it. And for they may have voted against it, for instance. When we look at the state ratification conventions, it was majority vote determined whether that state would accede to the Constitution. It wasn't supermajority. If a minority said, I don't want to join, why isn't the minority able to say, this is a contract, I'm not joining, you can't bind me? Why, in theory, is that not right? If every individual has separate sovereignty, unless they give it up in a contract, they can walk their own way.
I'll give you my response, Bruce. Given me the fact is that I've already been self-described as an anarchist, so I do believe that no document, should be able to bind to me, should be binding to me. So I think I should be able to have the right of exit, as a philosophical point of view. I do believe that that's the case. Now, a majority of people will make sure I'm not able to exercise that right. But do I believe I have that right? Yes, I do. Do I believe I have the capacity of enforcing it? No, I don't. Okay. So given the fact that on an individual level, I think I should philosophically and morally have that right. I should not have to fund what I find repulsive to fund. So I should not, I view taxation as well as theft. I should not allow theft. So I mean, a lot of the things that Lysander Spooner, wrote about, I strongly agree with. Now, going back to what Bill has said, I think a more workable solution is, and that's why I gave the example of, like a shareholder in a company. A shareholder in a company, yes, a shareholder can exit, by no longer being a shareholder, but as long as they're a shareholder, that they could, then they're accepting that there are certain governance rules, and they're voluntarily entering into those governance rules, and they have a way of exiting. They could sell.
Yeah, but pause just a second, Jeffrey. Pause for a second, because you and me, none of us on this program agreed to anything. We didn't sign anything. We were at the Constitution Convention. We didn't exist at the time. We didn't ratify any of the amendments, and neither did any of our audience do that. So the analogy doesn't work. If you're a shareholder, you take an affirmative act to buy shares, right? Then you can sell them. That's not the case with regard to the Constitution.
That's why I agree with Jefferson's position. Is the fact is that the Constitution should have only bound the signatories, and that generation, and each generation gets an opportunity of, and I'm comfortable with it being on a state level.
But why are you comfortable, Jeffrey?
And
the state boundaries. Wait, Jeffrey, pause. Okay, we got to go back to first principles. Why? The state boundaries were all artificial. Nobody voted on them. It was the king who gave these charters. What's so sacred about these boundaries? Completely artificial. Nobody voted on those boundaries. They were just imposed. And moreover, with regard to the signatories, what about the people like Patrick Henry who voted against? How come he gets bound by the majority? If he's right and I don't want to enter into the contract, if I sign a contract, Jeffrey, I can't bind anybody else. I can bind me. That's all. So under your theory, only those who voted in favor of ratification should be bound. The others would say, nope, doesn't make any difference to me. I'm going to have separate sovereignty.
I think I've already stated, Bruce, at least from my position, is, and when I include Bill as much as he wants to participate in this, is, and I don't want us just to get caught up on this issue, because I'm sure there are a lot of things we agree upon, and let's not just focus on what we disagree upon, so we don't have to spend the whole hour on this, narrow conversation. But just let's say is, I'm an anarchist, so I don't believe in any government, and I believe I have the right to exit as a sovereign individual, and I think everything is artificial. So I think any documents are artificial documents that I have not personally, individually, consented to. So I don't believe anyone consent on my behalf. I think that's immoral. I think it's amoral. I think it's illegitimate. I think it's unjust. So, but you live in a certain world, and there are certain parameters, and some things can be enforced upon you because, it's hard. You don't have the ability to, enforce your own claims. So, I can hole up in my house, arm myself, and anybody makes a claim against me, I can, trespass on my property. I can start shooting. But the reality is I'll never have enough weapons to protect myself against all the people that want to coerce on me. So I kind of accept, things, not because I find them legitimate. I kind of accept the fact is that I have a disadvantage in forcing my view of the world. So that's all. So I understand your point of view. You think the world I like is a bad place, is worse than the current world. I think the world I like is better than the current world, and we could just agree to disagree, because I think if we'll just continue this exchange, you're not gonna move your position, and I'm not gonna move mine. I think we pretty much understand each other on where we stand, and I stand on one end of the spectrum, and you stand on another, and you might be right, and I acknowledge I might be wrong, but that doesn't mean I don't believe what I believe, and I think my arguments are legitimate to me. And they only have to be legitimate to me. So I don't need to convince anyone else.
No, listen, I just want to make this observation, because I agree, we need to move on.
Yes.
The world is imperfect, right? Because human beings are imperfect. We can't develop a world where all the rules yield perfect justice. So we're trying to come to what you might call the Aristotelian mean, where it optimizes justice, even though there's still some injustices. And my position is that though there's legitimacy, and I respect your view, that it ultimately ends up with more injustice than if we take some of the injustices that come from having a constitution that binds people who didn't actually sign it. One of the reasons, as an illustration, is under your theory, somebody who didn't like you could say, you know what, I'm going to drop atomic bombs and destroy you. And it says, I'm a sovereign state and I can declare war on anybody I want. And I believe that history and experience teaches that's in fact what happens in a state of nature. That's how human beings act. Read the what's the book of the novel about the kids who are on an island. They all turn into monsters.
Oh yes, The Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, The Lord of the Flies. Yeah. Now we can disagree because we're trying to postulate what the world would look like, in a situation that isn't there right now. So we don't have, a laboratory experiment like you can do on chemistry or something. Anyway, that's what my reading of history is. Because I want to underscore, I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't sound ideas behind your principle. I'm just trying to suggest, which is why Madison told Jefferson, and Jefferson agreed, listen, the cure is worse than the disease. Because if you have the Constitution expire after those who signed it pass away, then there's going to be lawlessness where everybody runs around and tries to have a new Constitution convention, and they'll be shooting each other with AK-47s rather than negotiating.
Let me say
why Madison told Jefferson. Jefferson didn't persist. He agreed.
Let me pose this, and then let me turn this over to Bill.
Yeah.
So get Bill back involved in the conversation. Yes, at that point in time, they did have a conversation, I think, with respect to, I don't know if Madison ever convinced Jefferson with respect to the debt. Okay.
No, the debt was different.
So the debt is different than renewing the
Constitution. Yeah.
But then, I would pose a different question: is if Madison woke up today and saw the document and was reading the opinions of the Supreme Court and the assertions of claims and referencing him back to what we see today, okay, Madison might reconsider, where he went wrong, okay, and might have said, maybe Jefferson didn't propose the right solution, but maybe Jefferson understood the problem better than I did, okay, because Madison was willing to bet that ambition would counter ambition, and the whole framework relies upon that working. And if it doesn't work, then you get what you have morphed into today, which I think, and this maybe I'll hand it off to Bill, is I think if you take a look at a strict constructionist approach using the original intention strictly construed as Jefferson had advocated for behalf of how the Constitution, should be viewed, it's like, the way I look at it is you have a hard budget constraint. It can only be changed if you have to pass this test of basically altering it. So the more difficult you make it to amend it, then you're not going to have it. Then it'll not be changed overnight, by whims. So it's like, what we've learned is when we moved the dollar from gold, we started having a high rate of inflation. Okay, then we stopped having balanced budgets. We went to extreme budget deficits. So once you start removing constraints and give a lot of discretion ultimately will be abused. And I think Jefferson's point of view, as I interpret it, is he wanted constraints. He wanted constraints on government. He was so concerned about tyranny. He wanted to oppose as many constraints as possible, and I think Madison was less concerned about putting the type of constraints that Jefferson wanted to put on. Is my assessment. So, Bill, maybe this is a point to hand this off to you. So for you to have it done. So.
I think you make an interesting point. I believe it was Lance Banning and his Sacred Fire of Liberty, a book on Madison, that Banning argues that perhaps if Madison could see what happened in the future, maybe not even as far as our future, but certainly today, that the Constitution might have had a third non-signer at the convention, though we all know he was the quote-unquote father of the Constitution, prime writer of the Virginia Plan, etc. But yeah, I think you make a valid point that where we are today is so far removed from the structure foreseen that I would even think Hamilton might even cough a little bit.
No, I'm not disagreeing with both of your observations. I think if you read the Declaration of Independence, it says when you reach that state where the government is evincing a design to reduce you under absolute despotism, at that point, there isn't any constitution. You have a right to go back to square one and rewrite your constitution, your arrangements for governance, and to provide better, safer safeguards of your liberty. But that's at that point, you're not walking into a court of law. At that point, it's just the force of public opinion. And if you need to, you got to go to the barricades. That's what they understood, because at July 4th, 1776, they didn't walk into any international court. They said, we've had all of our reasonable pleas. The only way we can do this is by force of arms. And that's what they did. It's the last resort, they said, because typically when you resort to force of arms, the most horrible people come to power. Not always, but frequently. It was a miracle that we ended up with George Washington, who didn't want a crown, but you resorting to force of arms, he could have become a successor to King George. He didn't. That was a miracle. I consider the convention a miracle. I said, well, I'm not betting on it happening again. But anyway, that's the remedy, other than impeachment and removal from office, which is something that Congress can do without the interference by the courts. So that's the remedy, if you will. And I do think that that Madison and Jefferson would have understood. Both placed a high premium on education is necessary, almost the alpha and omega of retaining the Constitution, in some kind of recognizable form. It was Jefferson who said, if you hope to be free in a state of civilization and ignorant, you hope what never was and never can be. And it was Madison who said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And if they can be faulted, they could not believe we would ever have generations who would be so disrespectful of wisdom and knowledge and understanding, and get their enthusiasms from TikTok or Taylor Swift or Halftime's Bad Bunny or the Super Bowl or stuff like that. It's not that they didn't understand amusements, but they understood the serious part of life. Why do I exist? How do we pursue justice, which doesn't have an easy answer? And they would understand that the Constitution would fall apart if you have an epidemic of constitutional illiteracy, which is what we have today. They want it, but they didn't. But what are they going to do? They can't force everybody to read books and deliberate and spend their time a way that a citizen should, which is about keeping stability and drawing a sensible dividing line between order and freedom.
And I think that's what's important about Bill's book, is as it says, it's one of the Constitution is one of the most studied and most willfully misunderstood documents in American life.
Yeah.
So I think that's why the subtitle, The Independent Guide to the Constitution, the subtitles are basically Original Intentions, Modern Inventions. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what is now applied against us are modern inventions. They're not original intentions. They have no resemblance to what the founding generation had aspired us to represent, and it's been done. I think willfully is a very good word. Bill, are there examples that you'd like to provide specifically related, that, as you addressed in your book, that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I think we could just pick two. Sort of the engine of the modern state is the Commerce Clause and the spending power, neither of which are anchored in any original intent of the framers. Obviously, for the Commerce Clause, one, and I think Bruce mentioned this earlier, the establishment of a free trade zone, essentially, between the 13 colonies there. And secondly, with foreign commerce, regulate deep water shipping, essentially, be able to negotiate trade with Great Britain, France, etc. there. And it was this traffic in good commodities that the framers were making regulating. Whereas today, the court, essentially anything that could possibly substantially affect in the aggregate a market can be regulated by Congress. Most of our criminal laws are not attached to any enumerated power other than the Commerce Clause, because some item at some time in its existence crossed a state border, so you have that. The spending power, obviously, in answering anti-federalist concerns, Madison and other Federalists, don't worry about this general welfare spending. There's a list of enumerated powers. For goodness sake, why would we have that if we could spend and do whatever we wanted outside the enumerated powers? Of course, Supreme Court in the New Deal looked at Madison's position and Hamilton's position, and frankly, sort of a Hamiltonian combination with Joseph Story, and said, yep, you don't really need an enumerated power as long as you're spending for something you're not violating the Bill of Rights, it's intelligible to the states, etc. It's all good to go there. And that's really the twin engines of the modern administrative state that we have today. and the interpretations used on those two clauses are completely unmoored from anything that the framers understood or promised.
Yeah, but I think Bill, you omitted another contributing factor, which is the income tax amendment. Up until the income tax amendment, there wasn't a whole lot of money to spend anyway. We were running surpluses, so there was much less mischief that could be done with a spending clause. Initially, Jefferson was cutting defense spending. I think he was the only president ever who slashed defense spending. This is before the military-industrial complex. But even then, it was all supported by tariffs and excises, a little bit of sales, but not much. And it was really the income tax amendment which gave leverage to the federal government through the spending power, for sure. It goes back, however, to the understanding that you need a citizenry of critical thinkers, because the framers understood that there are going to be technological changes. There were technological changes prior in the centuries before 1787. They knew that. They were very, very literate people. If you look at, and there's certainly sensible reasons for departing from the text of the Constitution. For example, in identifying the powers of Congress to create an army or navy, it doesn't say anything about an air force, because they couldn't think about an air force, right? So nobody really thinks, well, Congress can't create an air force or have a satellite space division because it's not written there. Because they understood, well, what was the purpose of the defense powers is to prevent us from being attacked and conquered by another country. Similarly, I think, although it took a while, those like Brandeis and Holmes, those who were drafting the Fourth Amendment, when they put in, you're protected against invasions of persons, houses, papers, and effects, they didn't use conversations at that time unless you're eavesdropping. You didn't have telephones, you didn't have telegrams, you didn't have emails. And so they don't use those words in the Fourth Amendment. And yet, the Supreme Court initially said, well, communications, you can bug people. This came at the time of Prohibition. You're not protected by the Fourth Amendment and the government or the NSA seizing all of your communications, which seems rather odd since they're very, very sensitive. And the court had held earlier that even if you send an envelope in a mail, use the U.S. postal system, your contents is protected, even if it's in the temporary custody of the U.S. mail, from search or seizure absent a warrant. So you can only keep the Constitution sensible if you have some kind of brains and know where to draw the line between things that couldn't possibly have been anticipated by the framers and sticking with the purpose or goal. But we've become so deracinated and illiterate with regard to these larger, what I call philosophical purposes behind the Constitution, which, as Madison explained, justice is the end of civil society, it's the end of government, it's the end of why they even crafted a Constitution, that we're very, very bad on keeping the Constitution abreast of reality. And that's why people say, for example, well, there weren't nuclear weapons at the time of the Constitution, and therefore presidents can go to war on their own. Really? So we get all these ridiculous things, Korea and Vietnam, whatever. Well, no, that wasn't the reason why the war power was entrusted to Congress. It wasn't because of nuclear weapons. You read Madison and all the others, including Hamilton. The war power is entrusted to Congress because everybody knew, other than George Washington, those who would occupy the presidency would have an incentive to aggrandize power by concocting excuses to go to war. And that was a feature of human nature that never changes. We see it today. We saw it with Napoleon, Stalin, Mao, everybody else who's an executive and goes to war. And I make these observations to say you can't keep any Constitution sensible unless you have a literate, learned, philosophical society who understands the reasons behind the provisions and is faithful not only to the letter but the spirit. And when you have a society whose intelligence is decayed, they don't know anything anymore. I mean, literally nothing. When you have a Secretary of Homeland Security who says habeas corpus is to permit the president to deport anybody he wants for any reason, okay, you can't have rule of law then, including the Constitution.
Bill, do you want to comment on I have some comments, but Bill, I'll give you first shot.
No, I think Bruce makes good points about the need for an educated populace, and I don't really disagree with his history on executive power and the war power there either. So for this one segment, I can say I completely agree with Bruce Fein.
I have some comments, Bruce. Again, it's we have like type 1 or type 2 errors. So right now we have the type of error that says you make the document flexible, assuming that as we have an evolution in society, that we're reasoned, rational, thoughtful people that will interpret things in its proper context and meaning, adapted to the current circumstances, without completely divorcing it from its original intention. So that's assumption, I think, is such a false assumption. So if it's predicated upon assumption that is so unreasonable, going back to your example, like the Air Force, yes, they didn't mention an Air Force. So if now the technology exists, all they need to do is say, let's pass a constitutional amendment to create an Air Force. We don't have to say, well, they assumed that the technology didn't exist. I'd rather go back to the people saying, we've learned about this technology. I mean, look what we've done, like with the advantages of technology, and look at the surveillance state. Okay, look at the fact of the application of third-party doctrine. This is the type of stuff that we should expect if they don't have to come back to us. So the less things they have to come back to the people for authorization on, you got to assume they're going to continue to accumulate more power for themselves, and the only way to constrain them is to have to go back to the people themselves rather than just going back to the Congress. So yes, I would prefer that if they say, gee, new technology out there, we now can defend ourselves with an Air Force. Let's have a constitutional amendment to now have an Air Force. So, and then the people can say, gee, do I want to give the government the ability to arm itself even more than it already is armed? I mean, so then you can have a national debate and get the consent of the people before it's done. Right now, essentially, all this is done without the consent of the people. So,
well, I don't know, what about satellites and cyber?
The government no longer has to go back to the people.
Yeah, so, I agree. But Jeffrey, I think in some sense your attention with your examples, they're in tension with one another if they're not even colliding. For example, let's follow through with regard to the Air Force, because then you would have to have an amendment for satellites, cybersecurity, because there are new armaments all the time that wouldn't possibly.
Yes, I think yeah, that's not something.
And you would need to amend the Constitution, and I understand that's possible, but you'd keep having to go back over and over and over again.
Bruce, you can amend the Constitution to give more Article 1 powers. I mean, that's the point.
I understand.
Right now, these are taken in an extra constitutional.
Well, but I don't. I think
these are all inventions of you assuming reasonable people will have. Your assumption is we're going to have reasonable people checked by ambition. Okay, we've had 100 years of history showing, more than 100 years now, since 1913. I says, maybe people might have different dates, where essentially we don't have ambition checking ambition. We don't have reasonable people. We've just seen the expansion of power, and we've seen everything that we were warned not to have. We were not supposed to have too much factionalism. We were not supposed to be running deaths. And the worst thing was a single party rule with a lot of debt and a standing army. That was like the worst vision that they have. I mean, what do we need to say to sit back and say is this concept? What the practice of our government today has no relationship with our original document, and the most important changes that were done were not really done by amendments. Okay.
The Civil War amendments were important amendments. I think that was a very important.
We didn't get to the personal use of a standing army. A personal use of a standing army like we have today, and $38 trillion, almost $38 trillion of deficits, and $200 trillion more or less of unfunded liabilities. We didn't get that way through amending the Constitution. Okay. So if Jefferson and Madison walked up and said, gee, you know what, this government was able to have, we have troops all over the world. We have the biggest standing army. We're spending $1 trillion on defense. and we have the state that, and this all was done without any constitutional amendment getting it done, So,
No, but I don't think Jefferson. I think Jefferson
I
would.
don't
Jefferson.
think, I don't think they would say this is what, yes, this we've been a great success on this document. So you're assuming something that we've already proved doesn't work.
No,
Okay,
but things can change. And moreover, with regard to Jefferson didn't say a standing army was unconstitutional. He cut it from what John Adams had, and then he expanded it to fight the Barbary pirates who were plundering U.S. maritime commerce, as a condition of doing any kind of trading in the Mediterranean. He went back and he didn't need an amendment to the Constitution. He got Congress to authorize him to use the U.S. Navy for that purpose. Madison had to use the U.S. Navy in fighting the Second Barbary Wars. But I want to go back, Jeffrey. I think more important to show you that it's not so easy, I think, in terms of being having the optimal approach. And I always use optimal because there's no perfect approach given the defects in human nature. And that is, you had complained, I think rightly as I would, that the U.S. Supreme Court has used this third-party doctrine to mean that you can intercept our emails, you can intercept our conversations, you can intercept all the things in the world that we send over the airways and we don't have any constitutional amendment because the Supreme Court said, hey, you know what? These aren't covered by the Fourth Amendment. You share it with anybody else, even electronically. It goes back to the Olmstead case saying, hey, the Fourth Amendment only protects against persons, houses, papers, and effects, and therefore nothing else is protected. But you're saying that's wrong, and I agree. I mean, it was Scalia, who's an originalist, who said, no, if you stand on a sidewalk and you take some instrument that can identify thermal bursts in a home to see if marijuana is being grown, he says, without any warrant, that's an unreasonable search and seizure. If you have an airplane, Jeffrey, that comes over your home and takes drone pictures of you, a few yards above your roof, you're going to say, without a warrant, they're going to say that's an unreasonable search and seizure, even though these encroachments couldn't have been understood by the framers because the technology wasn't within their mind. I'm just saying that you got to have some leeway, and it's true. You got to have brains to know where to draw the line. In some sense, civilization is drawing lines, right?
We show we don't have the brains to do it, Bruce. I think that's.
I'm saying that's what we should be striving to with people like Bill, who are in universities trying to teach. Now, we may not succeed, but I'm saying that that's the goal that we need to aspire towards. And if we don't succeed, all right, we're going to end up with despotism, to be sure. If we do not have people who know how to think and deliberate and understand justice is the goal, as elusive as it may be to define, we're done as a self-governing people where liberty is our glory, not power and raw, naked authority to run roughshod over anybody who doesn't have a gun. And then maybe that's where we're going to pass away there. I just want to be on the barricade that says, okay, I want to die on that hill. Education, wisdom.
Bill?
I think Bruce could add virtue there as well, with the classical Republican tradition that you couldn't keep a republic without a virtuous people. And you just have to turn on the television or go somewhere on the internet to figure that has been long gone. So that combination, what Bruce has pointed out about an educated citizenry that can think, that cares about something other than their own comfort, and a virtuous citizenry as well. Without that, you turn out the lights and it's getting dim in here.
Yeah, I agree. And it may be that we're going to pass away because of that cultural phenomenon. We think it's not likely because, in terms of infinite time, we're just like a blink of an eye. And so since our lifespans, at least our corporeal lifespans, are limited to maybe 100 years max, and in infinite life, that's like nothing. And so we think because if it hasn't happened in our lifetime, it's not going to happen. But it is going to happen. And maybe it's not going to happen for 20 years, 50 years, 100, but it is going to happen. And we're going to be eliminated, and the universe and the galaxy, the Milky Way, will write us off as completely insignificant because we didn't use our brains to make us more than just apes and animals.
No, I still, I still, I, when you design a system where the expectations of the ability of people to sustain that system, is not likely, you've designed poorly a system. Okay.
But
So
there isn't any alternate system. All I'm saying is, Jeffrey, it's poor, but it beats all the alternatives. What Churchill once said about democracy: it's really bad and stupid, but all the other ones have been even worse. That's going to happen, no matter what system you have.
but first, I still want to get back to the example you gave.
Okay.
The example you gave is, you assume that there's a document written, technology and other things evolve over time, and you assume reasonable people will construct that into the context of the meaning of what that original document intended, and they will be faithful to that. Okay, you assume that'll happen. Okay, I assume that'll never happen. Okay, and I think that it hasn't happened. So now the question is, which do I prefer? Mm-hmm. Do I prefer something where every time, every little change needs to be a constitutional amendment, or do I prefer to give discretion to 9 people who supposedly are possessed with a wisdom that makes them something far to that they become the philosopher kings that the Greeks talked about? So I'm not interested in being governed by philosopher kings. What I am being more interested in is that if it's a choice between, does the government come back to me too frequently or not enough? It's again the type 1 or type 2 errors. Which mistake do I want to make? The mistake I want to make is I want the government coming back to me too frequently rather than not frequently enough. The choice you seem to be making is that you're okay with a system where the government, where you'll give a lot more discretion to the government, and you'll keep hoping that education and virtuous people, will emerge, and they will present this check on the system that so far that hasn't worked out too well. So I want the remedy to be, we've tried giving these people the benefit of the doubt. They've proven that they don't deserve it. So now you have to put them on a leash, and you have to have them come back to the people much more frequently than they should have. And a lot more things needs to be done by amendment. And even as these little things like, drones and Air Force and stuff like that. Yeah, doing a drone over your property is like throwing a kite or a baseball or something else over the property. At the end, most property owners will say, this doesn't belong here. I'm not claiming possession of it, but I'm giving it back to you. But you're a lousy neighbor if you keep throwing stuff over onto my property and keep trespassing it with your stuff. Your stuff is not entitled to pass onto my property, whether it's your baseball, whether it's your pet, whether it's a drone. It can't trespass. So yeah. I think a lot of this stuff, really is a lot simpler than people make it out to be.
Now, but Jeffrey, I disagree. For example, how high above your home do you own? If an airplane is flying, how many feet above? You have a right to stop an airplane flying from Los Angeles, to New York City, because they over 3,000 feet. If you took the airspace directly above your home, you do own that.
I think if an
it's not that easy.
I think there's international law about airspace.
No, come on. International law is nothing. International law is whatever you want. Whatever the strong countries can enforce it.
Let me answer the question, Bruce, that you asked.
Okay.
Yes. There is something called rights of easement, right? Where people, you come property that people have a right to
easements on land, yes. Yeah. Easements on land.
So to me, it's the same concept of their easement. We have a sidewalk across. We live in a house and we have a sidewalk, and people can walk past our house. Okay, but they can walk past our house, but they can't. As the example you just gave, they can't use some sort of technology to look inside my house while they're passing by my house. They can't trespass on the privacy of my house. So they're not entitled to observe me. They're just entitled to go by. That's the purpose of it. So it's the same, whether it's the sidewalk in front of my house or the airspace above it. It's the same principle. Okay?
But there were the limits.
It's pretty simple to me.
The sidewalk.
This is the way I see it.
The sidewalk, Jeffrey, has metes and bounds. The airspace above you, where do you draw the line? It doesn't have metes and bounds. It goes infinity.
People can use the sidewalk for the same way they can use. Why do we let people have sidewalks in front of the house? So people can walk from one house to the other. Okay?
Yeah, I understand it. I don't understand where. Somebody could say, where in property does it say, if I am legitimately on the sidewalk and I want binoculars, And their argument is, if you don't want me to see into your house, go put in and don't have any windows. That's your problem, not mine. I have a right to use my binoculars wherever I want. The point is, these are things that require you to use your brain and draw balances, right? That doesn't come from an algorithm. AI isn't going to tell you where to draw the line. And I'm saying that's essential for any form of government. You have to have some discretion. It shouldn't be limitless discretion. And people who are educated, even if they can disagree at the small points, they have a general in orders of magnitude. Yeah, this is kind of the line that you draw. Like yelling fire in a closed theater. But if you don't have any education, it's out the window. You can't have self-governance without education. It'll all be at that point. It's just going to be majority oppression, because the majority can get it wrong all the time. This idea that we have to obey the majority. If the majority said, you know what, we're going back to the geocentric theory of the universe, are we going to accept that as being acceptable? Are they going to say pi is 3? Oh, okay. Majority is there, but they can get it wrong. They can get it wrong all the time too.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
If I'm the FBI or CIA or whatever, without a warrant, can I go in front of your house, put my binoculars in, and watch you all day long?
You may be able to under the existing rules. It's unclear given the Supreme Court's decisions on this court.
So I don't ever need. I can drive in front of somebody's house with surveillance technology, and just sit there and not get in a warrant and use whatever technology appearances, and do this all without a warrant. You're saying that that's allowed?
Yeah, if they're, I don't think that they could target you because of your race or religion.
No, for whatever reason, they just want to go up.
If they just wanted to sit there, yeah, I think that probably would be permissible. They said, yeah, well, your house is exposed, third-party doctrine. That's your problem. I mean, right now, Jeffrey, you walk outside and there's and you have a drone taking videography of you. They can do that without a warrant.
And you think this is what James Madison intended?
No, I'm just, Jeffrey, you're shifting between what the current law is as expounded by the U.S. Supreme Court and what I would do if I'm sitting as a justice. If I'm sitting as a justice, I'd say there's no way, because I understand the purpose behind here. Provide an area of seclusion, to gratify someone's desire to harass somebody by just sitting outside, somebody's home. I don't believe justifies, intruding on someone's private area. But I'm just describing as U.S. Supreme Court. They'd say that's acceptable. I mean, I think the third party doctrine is insane. Because you walk outside, the government can now with drones take videos of you and stick you in
the third party doctrine is a derivative of the Madisonian system that you're deferring to.
It is the U.S. Supreme Court
to rewrite the Constitution without an amendment process.
Yeah, right.
So, Bill, what do you think about this conversation?
I would just point out that let's not forget that if we had a healthy republic, rather than it sort of being a dichotomy between, the court or amending the Constitution, we have a legislature and we elect representatives every 2 years. Of course, we have almost perpetual incumbency, it often seems like. But in a healthy republic, if there was a privacy concern about drones, rather than letting the court deal with the Fourth Amendment or trying to amend it, Congress could simply amend the federal rules of evidence, for example, and prohibit introduction into court of drone photos of taken of Jeffrey's house without a warrant or whatever. So there is that third option, again, in a healthy republic. How healthy we are, oh no.
Yeah, but even if we're talking about practicalities, and I agree with your observation, Bill. I believe the majority of our ails are ills because Congress has become completely anemic. It's AWOL. They haven't even addressed anything. The last time they addressed the technology is 1986, 40 years ago. The internet was in its infancy. They do nothing. They could go up there, the big tech, they make their political action committees and nothing happens. Okay.
That's why I use the caveat, a healthy.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because right now, yeah, the Congress has turned into what I call a constitutional ink blot. They do nothing other than get reelected and make sure that they don't have to comply with the handiwork that they produce for all of us. And so I think we're all struggling, given the staggering deviations from what we would agree is the original intent and understanding is what's the least bad thing that we can do today. It's not choosing between, very, very pleasant options. And that's a political calculation more than a philosophical calculation. And maybe all of our remedies are going to go down the drain because the culture has become so decayed. It's not capable of protecting liberty anymore. It's just government power. And I mean, that's basically what the current administration has said. Stephen Miller and Trump, we do whatever we want. If you don't like it, that's your problem. And they say that's always been that way. Well, maybe it was been that way in China, Russia. It wasn't that way at the time of the founding of the U.S. Constitution. We actually had, a government that celebrated liberty more than power until the first generation passed away. And then we had Manifest Destiny and Mexican-American War, and then all these other things, progressive decline. But it did show that when you had an educated citizenry and people who occupied office, had virtue, as you point out, at least a modicum of it, the system worked. But then when they passed, it's been a one-way decline. And I don't know whether no other empires ever walked back from the precipice. We would be the first one if we accomplished it, but we're certainly not going to do it with TikTok and amusements substituting for wisdom and philosophy as the centerpiece of our civilization.
Yeah, I don't think it would hurt to point out that John Taylor of Caroline, in his Tyranny Unmasked, essentially argued that there's a major shift toward tyranny when, rather than the government receiving its support from the people, i.e. through whether it be tariffs, duties, or an appropriate, say, direct tax, where the people all of a sudden are being supported by the government, which is, you look whether it be Social Security, Medicare, healthcare, SNAP benefits, EBT cards, what have you. He saw that as sort of the demarcation where we would slip from a republic to something else. And Lord knows we're way down the track on that.
Yeah, well, that's very, very true, Bill. And I think what even complements it in a different respect, but I think the idea is the same, is that when you have the administrative regulatory state, when getting the FDA needs to approve your new drugs so you can make money, you need to get the government's approval to do mergers and open bank branches and everything of that sort. You need them to clear NEPA, it impacts the corporate structure then becomes silent. They don't want to antagonize government because they figure with all this discretion in the administrative state, they're going to destroy me. I can't anger them. So they won't speak up anymore. They're cultivating. And we see that even with the media now, with deals with Trump. Okay, we'll pay you $15 million for a frivolous defamation suit, but you need to approve our merger. And that happens the next day. Oh, he'll give you a special interview, at ABC News. So when your fortune is tied to the government, then it induces a docility, which is the absolute opposite of what you need in order to keep vigilance and the government in check. And that's what we see in spades today.
Yes, I strongly agree with that statement. I mean, it's can we say we really have a society that has free speech?
Yeah.
You don't have a society of free speech if you look at the trade-offs between me speaking my mind and not getting deals approved and by the government. The people who I have to ask for permission for will stop granting me permission if they check my social media and see things they don't like. Then the question is am I likely to say I'm better off just keeping my mouth shut? Exactly. So or I'll falsify my preferences. So then what happens to public discourse when it becomes when basically one group gets its speech amplified because it's consistent with what those in power prefer, so it's consistent with their preferences, and then the others that would counter that speech remain silent, or they mimic the speech of the ruling elite at that point in time.
Yeah.
So then are you really getting any sort of real public debate on anything? So it seems that vesting that power doesn't seem to be conducive to it really enlightened rational dialogue on policy, because if you disagree, there's a significant cost. There's a cost of disagreeing, and there's a benefit of agreeing.
Right.
So yes, I'm allowing everyone to speak freely, but everyone who agrees with me, I'll give $1 million to.
Yeah.
And everyone who disagrees with me, okay, will be put in jail. Okay. So how many people will end up? Maybe some people will stay silent, or maybe everybody will end up agreeing with me, whether they really agree with me or not. That's kind of like our society today. So, so we have the illusion of free speech. We don't have free speech. We have a lot of, I think, either people silent because they think silence is golden in the sense that you won't suffer adverse consequences, or you have preference falsification because that produces a benefit to you that's more valuable than circulating truth. Okay, so that nobody will listen to. So these are all perverse incentives, and I don't know how we can get any form of decent government with all these perverse incentives. And all these perverse incentives are, as what both of you have pointed out, they're a product of an administrative state. A state where you have to ask for permission for a lot of things that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison never would have thought that you need to ask permission for all the things that we need to ask permission now. So, to have a government that spends, 3% of GDP that's funded by excise taxes and some tariffs, as opposed to a government that has the amount of volume of rules we have of the regulatory state, the administrative bodies, that almost everything you need to do in your life, you need to ask permission for, from somebody, in the government, and they have pretty broad discretion on whether they grant that permission to you or not. It's not like there's a lot of due process involved if you're denied, if you're denied it. So all these are perverse incentives that basically rewards people for being obedient and compliant, and significantly punish dissent. So in an environment like that, how can you really sustain a republic?
It is. Well, that's the challenge that we confront today, and the government keeps growing bigger and bigger all the time. So I don't know. I mean, the fact is, we may be destined to pass away. I don't know how you.
And I think my point is, going back to the beginning, and maybe Bill will either agree or disagree, but my point is, I viewed Jefferson as more concerned about tyranny than Madison, and I think Madison believed he could engineer it better, and I think Jefferson was was more skeptical of that, and maybe he couldn't be a better engineer, than Madison. Of course, if Madison would have listened to Jefferson with respect to putting in a limit for that all debts had to be paid off, in people's lifetime, and you cannot be an intergenerational transfer of debt, we would see a lot smaller government today, if we couldn't do that. So just putting that into the Constitution, I think would have made, had a material impact. Unfortunately, Madison was overconfident in his ability of ambition checking ambition.
No, well, I think number one, remember, Madison was appointed by Jefferson twice to be a Secretary of State. So Jefferson had great confidence in James Madison. In fact, he wanted Madison to move to become a next door neighbor in Virginia, but Madison understood he'd be there all of the time. He wanted an independent existence. But I think that you're doing an injustice to Madison here. Madison believed that not that human nature could be turned into everybody being Sir Thomas More, or a virtuous creature. He understood that George Washington's were 1 in 1,000 years, but he believed that if you actually honored separation of powers, that you didn't have to rely so much on virtue. You would rely upon people pursuing their self-interest would still block each other from exercising a controlling or a tyrannical power over anyone else. And I do think that without the 17th Amendment, the income tax amendment, you didn't necessarily need the prohibition upon debt transfers because there wasn't all that much debt. We had paid off all the debts that we had incurred during the Revolutionary War by the early 1800s. I mean, Albert Gallatin, our Secretary of Treasury, was running surpluses at that time. That was within less than 15 years after the war had ended, 1783. And I believe that we were not running these huge debts that we now encounter. Up until
who appointed Gallatin?
Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
But
and it's his statue at the Treasury Department, right? Not Alexander Hamilton. It's Gallatin.
Yeah.
And what did Jefferson do? I think he cut spending.
He cut spending. He cut the military.
He cut spending. He cut the military, and he acquired.
Louisiana. But Congress had to appropriate $20 million to acquire Louisiana in a treaty.
And he still cut spending, right?
And he still cut spending overall. Yeah, they were running surpluses. They had a sinking fund to retire the debt that was incurred during the Revolutionary War. And I do believe that without the income tax amendment, the United States would be a totally different country today, because we'd still have to actually rely upon different sources of income and people weren't going to pay, 100, 500% tariffs, and create monopolies domestically. That just wasn't politically viable. And I don't think we can fault Jefferson or Madison for not anticipating the 17th Amendment ratified over 100 years later. I mean, they had clairvoyance, but not that much.
Bill, comments on this?
No, I mean, I think Bruce's point about the 16th Amendment, the income tax amendment, is good. I would argue also, I guess, sort of in defense of Madison, that had the federal government existed within the enumerated powers as he and the other Federalists promised, if we could go down the list of what we're spending money on, how much of it is outside the scope of what the federal government is charged to really do. Obviously defense is a big exception to that. Of course, it's not really defense today. It's more, the imperial budget, which was not intended anyway. But nonetheless, if we stuck with the enumerated powers, we wouldn't have the debt that we have today. So much of it is the federal government taking on tasks and issues that has no business, that were local, intended to be local matters, and voila, we have what we have.
Yeah, and I think also, again, in defense of Madison, when he was arguing this was the obligation of contracts clause, he deplored, he said, we do not want a system where people make money speculating on public measures. They want them to build better mousetraps. Don't speculate on public measures. And that's, he was concerned, at least at that time, with a lot of these debtor prohibitions on that limited the ability of creditors to collect on debts. But that's what, and he understood that he doesn't want people out there. He doesn't want lobbyists who get money speculating on public measures. He wanted them private measures to focus like Adam Smith, on building the better mousetrap and having the invisible hand make people wealthy only by doing things that other people want them to do, by showing how much money they're willing to pay for it. And that's another provision of the Constitution that's got basically overturned, is the obligation of contract, where the government flouts contracts daily without paying for it, including the gold clause in 1935.
And why would it not be possible for taxpayers to have standing to bring lawsuits against the government for spending money and going to the courts and saying, these are enumerated powers that you have. We only gave you these enumerated powers. You're assuming more enumerated powers than we conferred upon you, and we're going to the courts to tell you, you can't spend this money because our compact was, you don't have the right to spend this money, and so we're going to have the Supreme Court telling you can't spend the money, even if you legislate it and the president signs it. The point is, both of you are doing something that the Constitution never enumerated as a right that you have. Why aren't there lawsuits like this? And maybe they have been. And
there were, Jeffrey. They started out, there are two cases called Frothingham and Mellon and Massachusetts and Mellon. Andrew Mellon at the time was Secretary of Treasury. They brought the exact points that you raised. Supreme Court said no standing. Sorry. and that's been, other than Flass v. Cohen, which says the only standing that you have under current law is if you challenge spending in violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, like paying, somebody, the government using federal money to proselytize. Other than that, taxpayers have no standing. That's the Supreme, whether they're correct or not, that's been the law for over 100 years. I confront it all the time. I mean, I feel the same way with regard to, I don't want my tax money going to support unconstitutional wars. Why am I paying money to support these illegal wars, whether it's in Vietnam, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Afghanistan or elsewhere?
So I don't have a standing with how the government spends my money that they take from me. I can't stop them from illegally spending my money.
Yeah, right. It's a crazy doctrine, but that's what it is. It's been around for 100 years.
Came from where?
Yeah, they just made it. They say it's not a case or controversy, that it's this argument that say, well, Jeffrey, you suffer like every other taxpayer. Unless it's your injury is distinct, you don't have standing. Well, how about maybe all the taxpayers ought to have standing to sue? Anyway, that's
so how many taxpayers do you need to have a class to have a class action lawsuit that would give you standing? So
no, I don't believe that you on the taxpayer standing, unless the court reversed, Frothingham and Massachusetts and Mellon. I don't think there's no class action that's ever going to succeed on that score.
So the government spending money beyond the scope of enumerated powers and running a $38 trillion deficit has not, and that translates into over $100,000 per an individual. Yeah. That doesn't qualify as me being adversely sufficiently impacted by this.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm not defending.
If you also have a Ponzi scheme in Social Security finance, where basically the government is going to say, we never really took money out, so we're going to take money from other people. We do other things because this was not adequately funded. So you're going to take a hit to your payment. That's also not material in nature that you've suffered significant damage from. So, I mean, that principle just seems to me, pardon the expression, just bullshit. So
that's not a lot of what the Supreme Court says.
It just doesn't seem to be, reasonable. What do you think, Bill?
No, Bruce is absolutely right on his statement of the law that, the general rule is there's no such thing as taxpayer standing. Again, I'm like Bruce. I'm not saying I'm good with that, but that is the rule. But I would even question, and as our system is so corrupt, that is it even worth trying to look to the Supreme Court for assistance? I mean, you think of the crisis of Alien Sedition Acts back in 1798. I think all three of us, maybe, this is quite a stretch, but we might all agree that the Sedition Act, which made criticism of the national government a crime, and it's, to just give the nutshell version, thumbnail of it, I think all three of us would probably agree that was an unconstitutional act at the time. Had the Jeffersonians tried to appeal to the Supreme Court, they surely would have lost, and that would have been upheld. And I think we're sort of in the same situation today, as it's not necessarily the courts that we should look to for succor, but, this is a long shot, and it's kind of what we've been talking about. But absent educating our fellow citizens, absent seeing people make better decisions at the ballot box, absent seeing people care about virtue in their republic, being able to intelligently discuss issues rather than, he said he's going to cut Social Security, I'm not going to vote, to just have the base fact of that. Absent this groundswell, absent this change in culture, we are doomed. Our plane is crashing. The court is not going to help us. That's a weak reed to be leaning on there. We're going to end up falling over, have our hands cut. it's got to come from the bottom, and just a major change with education, understanding, and the ultimate goal of society. And it can't be for me to try to have the government give as much of Bruce and Jeffrey's money to me as possible, while I do as little as possible. Again, maybe this is crazy. This is a long shot, but I think that's our only hope.
Yeah, I agree. Ultimately, we can't rely on the courts. We can't even rely on Congress independently unless we force Congress to do the right thing. And that means you have to have an activated, intelligent citizenry that stands up, and you can write in, you can email your member, and they do respond. I mean, I had 2 kids. They did internships in Phil Graham's office, in Frank Thompson's office, in Dick Army's office, and they do pay attention if it's actually handwritten more than emails, because it shows you put some labor into it. But it doesn't happen anymore. And unfortunately, I think that we've trivialized life by celebrating all these, I call them juvenile amusements, instead of the serious business of self-governance, which is not easy, because the human species is not inclined to be wise, to be industrious, to be benevolent. It's more likely to be hormonal. So you got to work at it. It's not something that happens by spontaneous combustion, and our culture just is not there. It's not there. We don't, the textbooks, the education, it's ridiculously bad. These people, they graduate from elite colleges. They don't know who Socrates was. They don't know who Aristotle was. They don't know Plato's Republic. They don't know any of this stuff. They don't know who Madison was. The Federalist Papers are like foreign. They know who the best. They know Bad Bunny, but they don't know the Federalist Papers. These are the elite colleges and universities. I say, really? This is utterly absurd. And I think in part it's ironic. I think that when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, we became complacent. Hey, we're the good guys, God's chosen people. We can just rest on our laurels, and we don't have to work hard anymore. We'll just bestride the world like a colossus. We don't have to go to the moon. I mean, when I was growing up, Khrushchev said he's going to bury us. So we actually had some intellectual rigor, because otherwise we'd lose out to the Soviets. That all went away, right? And so there are no standards anymore. And we kind of now are parasites off the wisdom of the framers, and this kind of isn't anything else to sustain us. And I would agree, it's just a matter of time before we fall off the precipice.
Yeah. There's one topic today that I think is really important to discuss, and so I'd like to bring it up in the remaining minutes we have. To me, I think this is a really crucial issue, and with respect to the midterms, and the comments made by both Trump and Noam. Trump did his Truth Social post, basically saying is that there's constitutional legitimacy to his takeover, and soon people will see what he discovered in the Constitution that other people have not seen, that validates his ability to take over the federal election apparatus. And then you have Kristi Noem's comments about considering this national security infrastructure, and I guess soon voter registration will be embedded into that national security infrastructure. So they're looking for, as Bill, what I've said to Bruce, a number of times, given my knowledge of Trump, over observing him over a long period of time as a New Yorker, I thought that what Trump really was, and some people might say this is a positive thing, some people say a negative thing, but Trump has been very successful his own life of finding loopholes or finding interpretations of things that other people have not really found. People can question how borderline they are or not, but he certainly is not someone who says, this is the intent of the law and let me operate within the intent of the law. He says, where can I find the exception and make sure that I'm the exception? So, and he's been skillful of that, throughout his entire life, and he approaches that now. And that's the peculiar thing about the Justice Department now, is that they're not really expected to uphold the law. When it's convenient for him, they got to figure out ways to get around the law so it doesn't do what really was intended to do, and they're looking for loopholes. which is kind of perverse in of itself. So now when you take a look at the application of this to the the midterm elections, and the midterm elections, this year could have very significant impact because it could determine whether Trump can sustain a majority in both the House and the Senate, or whether he'll lose it, maybe more likely in the House than the Senate. And if he does, maybe he and his family will go through the type of investigations that the Biden family was subject to, during Biden's administration and during when the Republicans, took over the legislature. And I would assume that would not be something that he would welcome very much. So, I don't think he wants to deal with the impediment of one branch having that type of bargaining leverage that currently it doesn't really have. So, and given the fact of, we already know what he was prepared to do at the election, right, in 2020. He was prepared to go and have a conversation with Mike Pence and basically put in fake electors, and it was what it seems that he was going to plan and basically have Mike Pence maybe declare him the winner. So by recognizing the fake electors and not the other electors. So we know to what extent he was willing to do to keep in the White House. So this issue of our quote election integrity system and the claims that being made today. Bill, Bruce, would you like to address this?
Yeah, listen. I think there's certainly credible evidence that Mr. Trump, prior on the November voting date this year, will invoke the Insurrection Act and send the military out to seize all voting machines and cancel the elections. I don't think right now in my own mind that's at the 50% level, but that surely is possible, especially his interpretation of the Insurrection Act and Kristi Noem, and his statement that, well, why are we even having elections? We shouldn't have to run against the Democrats. And maybe by putting this on the table, it'll deter him from doing it. But that, to my mind, is certainly within the realm of plausibility. That ought to be terrifying to us, because that would definitely be the end of the country.
Well, if you take her exact words, and then I'll turn it over to Bill. I think her statements were kind of like, they have to make sure that the right people vote for the right candidates. I mean, think about, it's not to make sure that only citizens get the right to exercise their vote. The legitimacy seemed to be derived from only the right people voting, and I guess the right people are the right people if they vote for the right candidate. So if you don't vote for the right candidate, maybe you're the wrong person, and maybe you don't have the right to vote. I mean, it's a peculiar wording. I mean, so if you think about her choice of words.
No, it's not that peculiar. It sounds like Vladimir Putin in Red Square.
Bill?
Oh, no, I mean, I don't put much stock in the words of politicians. It's, they could say up and it's really down. I don't know. It's, I don't put much stock in their words. I would imagine if Trump didn't use the Insurrection Act in Minneapolis, or at least he had a better claim, I think it's quite a stretch to see that invoked in November, but who knows? Could be wrong. Just guessing here. Might as well give me a quarter and.
Yeah. I think Bill makes a good point. Minneapolis is not. I think the difference, Bill, and again, maybe it's not a difference in kind, but in degree, is that he's already said, if we lose the House, I'm going to get impeached again, and that's why we got to make sure that we don't. So in Minneapolis, impeachment's not on the table. In November, it possibly could be, which could push him to a new level. But maybe he wouldn't. I'm hopeful that he won't go that far. I'm just saying the fact that we're even having this conversation, it's an earmark how far gone this system is.
I think we go back to then the comment that I saw in the description of Bill's book, the willful misunderstanding. So that's a pretty sad commentary, and I think both both of you bring up the word virtuous is really important. Is the fact is that this experiment, and it's always been an experiment, will only succeed, if we're grounded in virtue, and I think the verdict has been so far that we're not sufficiently grounded in virtue. So,
but I just make this one closing observation. I think at the outset, I think we did have a system. Take George Washington. He could have been king. He said he didn't want to be king, and they said that his battlefield victories made him a hero, but his character made him a legend. And his virtue was so powerful that for over 100 years, no one could think of serving more than 2 terms in the presidency. It wasn't because there was a 2-term limit. It was just because you can't do something that George Washington didn't do. That is, that example from a virtue commanded that amount of authority that long. We haven't had George Washingtons for 100 years. There aren't any George Washingtons out there. And it's very hard to inculcate virtue when there are no real examples that you can say, wow, I want to be like that person. That really are selfless and wise and disciplined. And just reading about it is good and important, but without a real example, and most people today, certainly going through the elite schools, they don't even know who George Washington is, other than George Washington University or something of that sort. It's very hard to inculcate that idea. It's not impossible, but it shows the challenges that we had. At least the framers had George Washington, which was a big advantage.
Bill, I'd like to give you the last word, but I would like to interject a word before you have the last word. So, Bill, to thank you as being our special guest today, which is really appreciated. I'd like to tell anyone who is watching this that I will gift to the first 25 people that write into, and they should write into Johnny, Jonny, at BitChute.com, saying, I want a copy of Bill's book. I will send a Kindle copy to those that give the information. I guess I just need the email address. And so for the first 25 people, just write to Johnny, Jonny, at BitChute.com, and tell Johnny that you want a copy of the book. And for the first 25 people that write into Johnny requesting it, they will get a gift from me as my way of thanking Bill for appearing today. So, Bill, as a special guest today, please wrap up this conversation for us.
No, guys, I've enjoyed the conversation. It's good to talk about fundamentals, as we have done a lot today. Jeffrey, I'm glad you're enjoying the Independent Guide to the Constitution. I hope it proves to be a useful book for you, and who knows, maybe you'll have me back again.
Yeah.
I would love to have you back again. So anytime, just Bill, anytime you want to come back, anytime there's anything you want to talk about, either just on a one-on-one podcast with me or to join the panel with Bruce and I and Dennis when he gets back, just feel that you have an open invitation to participate as frequently as your schedule permits, and any topic you want to talk about with respect to your book or anything else that calls your attention and you just want to have it on the Wernick files, you have an open invitation. Just text me or email me, and we'll work out the logistics.
Much appreciated, gentlemen.
Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.